January 14th, 1944. Southern Italy at 5:20. A shallow frost lay across the ridge above Foggia airfield. Metal cooled slower than soil. The barrels of the Bofors guns exhaled faint ribbons of mist. Each weapon stood locked in line. 4 machines, 20 meters apart, facing east toward the wheat flats. Engines slept in the convoy behind them, ticking as they cooled. The sound carried under the fog like distant clockwork. Corporal Anton Weiss checked the elevation wheel again. The oil in the gearing was thick from the night cold. His gloves left dark marks where he'd warmed it earlier. Orders had been read twice before dawn. Hold fire until visual confirmation. No exceptions. Any mistake meant grounding flights for hours, maybe days. Logistics did not forgive errors. Across the field, a truck backfired once, then fell silent. Radio static swelled, soft and uneven. The squad leader paced behind the line, breath clouding in brief puffs. Weiss barely moved. His eyes followed the horizon through a narrow crack in the fog. A pale band of color separating field from sky. He had spent 3 years before the war, maintaining turbine assemblies at Daimler. Precision, torque, sequence, habits that had never left his hands. The Bofors felt similar. Gears and resistance, ratios that demanded rhythm, not force. He moved with that rhythm now, adjusting range by a fraction, feeling the recoil plate click into place. A faint hum reached them first. Engines, far off, layered. Not steady like a transport wing. The sound wavered, climbing, falling, climbing again. Weiss counted intervals, 30 seconds apart. The formation should have been tight, if friendly. This one drifted. Static flared again on the set, then broke. No signal. No code light. Fog thickened, swallowing the first line of wheat. Someone cursed under his breath. The air smelled of cold oil and old fuses from last night's test fire. Weiss kept tracking the sound, though the horizon offered nothing. Then dots. Faint, low, moving faster than regulation altitude. He steadied his hand on the sight lever. His rule, aim behind the lead, had drawn laughter during training. Too cautious, they said. But he'd learned from turbines. Delay could stabilize imbalance. What lagged might meet perfection a breath later. The squad leader raised binoculars, searching. No identification flare. No reply to challenge signal. Weiss saw one aircraft dip, then correct, the formation flattening unnaturally. A second later, the fog cleared just enough to catch a wing mark. Dark cross, not roundel. He fired. One round, then another. The recoil rolled through the frost like a pulse. Tracers cut the gray. 2 planes broke apart before the alarm even reached the other guns. The rest scattered north. By nightfall, reports confirmed it. Enemy reconnaissance, flying stolen identification. The squad was cited for quick action. The official commendation named Unit Discipline. Weiss's name was not included. Orders were orders. Initiative stayed off paper. In the debrief tent, an officer noted that the system worked as designed. He closed the folder without looking up. Weiss stood beside the gun that had frozen solid again by dawn. The supply trucks rolled past, carrying more shells, more fuel, more paper forms. The war machine continued its rhythm, indifferent and exact. Sometimes a rule breaks, and the system survives because of it. Would you have turned the wheel? Before the war, Anton Weiss worked in a hydropower plant along the Danube. He was 19 then, shaping gears by hand, fitting steel teeth until motion passed without sound. The rhythm never left him. 3 turns to torque. 1 pause to breathe. It was not poetry to him. It was sequence, stability. When the draft came, he packed his measuring tools first. By the time he reached the anti-air battery outside Foggia, the tools were gone, traded for uniform weight and grease-stained manuals. Still, his hands moved the same way, deliberate, symmetrical. The Bofors gun became another engine to him, Springs, oil seals, alignment under strain. He did not call it a weapon. He called it a system that happened to discharge fire. He listened more than he spoke. When others argued range or speed, Weiss adjusted pressure valves, checked the balance of the cradle mount, and let them talk. He had learned early that sound without precision wasted energy. The weapon, like a turbine, needed rhythm more than noise. Each morning, before the first command, Weiss wiped the frost from the barrel. The rag came away black with carbon, always the same pattern. Heavier near the muzzle. He noted it without comment, folded the cloth square, and started again. He inhaled the iron scent that clung to his gloves. It smelled of the Danube workshop, of metal dust on warm air. That smell steadied him. Discipline became his shelter. When men shouted, he turned inward to mechanics. The grind of gears drowned the arguments of war. Order lived inside repetition. But precision, when carried too far, isolates. The others laughed quietly, called him the gauge. They said he thought like a machine. He didn't deny it. Machines didn't panic. Machines failed only when the operator misunderstood their rhythm. He learned the recoil curve by touch, the time between ignition and return. His fingers began to anticipate the tremor, the lag before the gun steadied for the next round. He mapped those seconds in his head the way engineers measure current, invisible but constant. In spare hours, he drew arcs on the backs of field orders, sketching elevation and distance ratios from memory. He calculated drop, wind offset, and shell delay without instruments. It was his own form of prayer, numbers in sequence, like turning a crank. The manuals insisted on direct tracking, but Weiss noticed something. The shock of discharge shifted the barrel a hair before the shell cleared the muzzle. At speed, that margin meant miss or strike. He began compensating, not ahead, but slightly behind the moving target. A theory no manual would print. He tested it once in training. His round struck true while others overshot. The instructor called it luck. Weiss said nothing. The aim behind rule became his private conviction. A quiet correction to the official system. It violated regulation, but aligned with logic. He carried that deviation like a hidden fault under the surface of obedience. No one asked. He did not explain. Systems endure because someone reads their errors differently. And when the time came, his deviation would meet its proof. Silent, mechanical, exact. Every system needs its outlier. The Foggia airfield did not exist on its own. It was a junction point, one link in a chain stretched from the southern ports to the front line beyond Cassino. Every barrel of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every ration tin passed through its narrow corridors of mud and dust. Trucks rolled in before sunrise from Taranto, headlights taped, engines idling at low gear to save fuel. Drivers slept sitting up, waiting for signals that came by hand, not voice. The convoy routes were memorized like prayers. One turn missed could stall an entire wing of aircraft by morning. The airfield breathed to schedule. Power generators started at 05 Zursauer, communications checked at 07.10. Fuel pumps ran until 09.30, when voltage drops forced rotation. Repair tents lined the perimeter, canvas sagging under dew. Men worked in silence, each task timed to the next. When one gun failed, it was not an isolated fault. It was a skipped beat in a body of steel and wire that had to stay alive through precision alone. Weiss's station covered a northern approach sector, coded Line F. It was a small square on a logistics chart, yet its reliability affected sortie intervals across 3 air groups. Ammunition shipments arrived marked with red bands, anti-air specific. Each shell bore its weight stenciled to the gram. Supply clerks recorded usage to 2 decimal places, ensuring no round left the field without notation. The system trusted numbers, not instinct. By day, the movement was endless. By night, the silence grew mechanical. Pumps thudded. Oil drums shifted. Generators coughed in rotation. When the power grid faltered, the entire horizon dimmed for seconds before stabilizing again. Those pauses felt longer than they were. A reminder that every man on base was only as useful as the current running beneath him. Officers called it efficiency. To them, the war was an equation of throughput. Planes in, planes out. Fuel consumed, fuel replaced. The rhythm had no room for doubt. Men existed to maintain continuity, not to question it. The manuals described every contingency, except hesitation. Still, Weiss had learned to read the rhythm differently. When the clockwork ran too perfectly, he felt unease. The airfield's hum seemed too level that week. No delays, no errors, no cross-traffic on the supply lanes. Even the fog rolled in on time, each morning at 05 Ihag, as if following an unspoken directive. He logged his rounds with precision, but his eyes drifted to the horizon more often than regulation allowed. The sky seemed heavier than usual. A dull gradient, empty of movement, yet carrying a faint tremor. Static crawled across the radio lines without message, only hiss and pulse. It was not failure, but interference, the kind caused when something large moved beyond range. Somewhere in that ordered machine, a misalignment had formed. It was not visible on the charts, nor audible in the morning reports, but Weiss sensed it. His training said to trust the schedule. His instinct marked an imbalance the system could not measure. By evening, the supply trucks rolled again, their engines low, their cargo logged, their fuel exact to the liter. The rhythm held steady, but beneath it, tension coiled like wire under load, waiting for release. Every machine depends on tolerance, the narrow space between precision and failure. Would you have felt the fault line? By midday, the airfield stood under a still, white light. The frost had gone, leaving only damp outlines where crates had rested overnight. Wind shifted without warning, drawing a slow ripple across the wheat beyond the perimeter. Paper maps lifted at their corners. The flag above the outpost stirred once, then hung again. Everything seemed balanced on pause, the kind of silence that carried its own sound. The radio sets hummed low, not the clean tone of open frequency, but a steady vibration between notes. The operators tapped dials, listening, waiting for voice. None came. Static filled the room like distant machinery. Weiss heard it even from the gun line, that thin, continuous pulse that sat just above thought. Birds rose suddenly from the tree line, not all at once, but in fragments, as though the sky itself gave uncertain permission. They scattered, curved, and vanished east. Weiss watched them go. He did not mark it as fear or omen, only motion, unpatterned, unscheduled. A deviation. At 12:40 hours, radar reported interference. Not strong, but irregular, the kind that flickered and reappeared in uneven sweeps. The lieutenant read the figures once and called it weather scatter. "Hold to schedule," he said. Orders unchanged. The gun crew relaxed again. One smoked. Another wiped grease from his hands with a rag that was already black. They leaned on the carriage and spoke in half-sentences, words lost in the hum of the generator. Weiss remained at his post. He adjusted the sight by a fraction, more habit than thought. A mechanical correction to an invisible rhythm. He had learned long ago that systems lied in small ways first. A tremor in voltage, a decimal out of range, a delay in pulse. Now the radar trace carried that same unease. Faint echoes, overlapping, almost deliberate. He recalculated the arc, tracing where a signal might emerge if it had a body behind it. Sunlight reflected across the horizon, glinting on something that turned too slowly for a bird, too steady for drifting metal. Weiss watched it through the haze. No shape, only a reflection, a moving axis against the muted gray. He waited for confirmation code. None arrived. The lieutenant had moved on to the fuel report. The men folded their maps, closed their thermos lids, and returned to waiting. Weiss stayed still, The glint came again, softer now, lower, slipping between cloud and smoke. A test flight, perhaps. A weather kite. A trick of the sun. Every explanation felt possible, and yet none fit the pattern on the scope. He reached for the radio to log it. The channel was occupied. Base command routing supply numbers to Taranto, fuel columns delayed by an hour. He waited. Static filled the intervals between words. When the line cleared, the glint was gone. Weiss marked the coordinates anyway. Single entry. Time, bearing, elevation. He didn't speak of it. The lieutenant would have called it a phantom echo. Still, the figures stayed in his logbook. One neat row among the day's tallies. The entry seemed trivial at the time, a note among many. But later, when the rule broke itself, it would become the first line in the record that proved instinct had seen what the system could not. Every warning begins as noise. By late afternoon, the fog had returned from the valley, rolling low and dense across the ridge. It muted distance, swallowed outlines. The wheat fields below disappeared beneath it, leaving only sound. A fractured hum carried by wind. Engines. Not one, not steady. Uneven, layered, drifting in and out of range. Weiss lifted his head, listening. The noise lacked the rhythm of a friendly formation. No fixed altitude, no harmonic drone. Each pass rose and fell irregularly, like a machine out of calibration. He marked the intervals with his fingers against the cold metal of the gun carriage. 10 seconds, then 6, then 12. The pattern failed every rule he knew. The manual was clear. Fire only after visual confirmation. Identification before engagement. Every line of training drilled that principle until it became muscle. Guesswork was error. Error meant grounding aircraft, losing trust, breaking the arithmetic that held the front together. Still, Weiss had begun to calculate. The air was damp, dense enough to slow sound. Wind came from the east at 9 knots. That shifted the echo by 2 seconds, maybe 3. He traced the angles in his head, compensating for recoil, shock lag, and barrel drift. The math formed quietly behind his stillness, a sequence of corrections. The lieutenant paced behind the gun, voice low but sharp. Hold position. Wait for signal. Orders sounded simple when detached from consequence. Weiss nodded, steady as always. His hand rested on the traverse wheel, fingertips black with oil and dust. He had obeyed every rule until now. Every command, every number on every page. But systems, he knew from turbines, relied on flow. Flow required correction, and correction sometimes meant breaking rhythm before it broke you. The sound grew clearer, climbing through the fog in waves. Somewhere to the south, a truck engine misfired, coughed, stopped. A moment later, faint flashes pulsed above the haze. Not lightning, not distant artillery. Something reflected light and vanished again. Weiss felt the weight of stillness press on his shoulders. The others smoked, watched, waited. The machine in front of him seemed to breathe, the barrel glistening with moisture. He exhaled once, slow and deliberate, as he had in the hydropower plant before aligning turbine blades. The logic was sound. His aim-behind rule, dismissed as superstition, accounted for delay in motion, lag in firing, recoil drift. It broke protocol but obeyed physics. The difference between the two was often a second. A second, he knew, could mean survival. He turned the wheel 2 degrees left, adjusted elevation by half a mark. The action was small, mechanical, yet the weight of it filled the space around him. In that fog, the system offered no guidance. Its charts, its timetables, its manuals, all written for clear skies and visible targets. The machine demanded patience. Instinct whispered deviation. He waited for a voice on the radio. None came, only static, the sound of circuits looping on themselves. The lieutenant called again. Hold fire. Weiss did not answer. He was listening to something else. A frequency not listed in any manual. carried through the air by engine tremor and memory. The fog trembled once more. He steadied his hand. Precision, he thought, feels heavier than fear. Would you have waited? The fog had thickened into substance, a gray curtain that pressed close to the barrels, dampening sound and sense. Engines droned somewhere beyond it, faint, misaligned, scattered in tone. The radio hissed without words. Orders hung in transit, waiting to be heard. Weiss stood over the sight, motionless except for the slow adjustment of his breathing. His thumb rested on the elevation wheel, the other hand on the traverse. The metal felt cold, precise, indifferent. Every number on the dial represented permission, but permission had not come. He shifted the sight backward by 4 degrees. No one saw it. The movement was too small, quieter than speech. A private rebellion performed in steel. The hum in the east grew louder. He matched it to his earlier calculation. Wind direction, sound lag, target drift. Everything aligned except command. Weiss held the sight steady, then squeezed once. Recoil moved through him like an electric surge, clean, immediate, final. Then, silence. The echo folded into the fog and was gone. For several seconds, nothing changed, only static. Then, through the haze, a single shape appeared. Black, burning, descending. Its engine sputtered once before vanishing behind the ridge. A dull concussion rolled across the field. The crew froze. None of them had seen the aircraft. None had expected sound to become impact so fast. One man stared toward the horizon. Another looked at Weiss, waiting for an order that hadn't existed. The lieutenant's voice cracked through the radio, half buried in interference. Hold. Fire. Repeat. Hold fire until confirmed. The words dissolved mid-sentence. Weiss didn't move. He listened. The sky still vibrated. More engines, same vector, same rhythm. The system was repeating itself. A column of sound entering the trap of its own precision. He made the second adjustment slower. 2 degrees this time. Another breath. Another squeeze. The second impact came sooner, sharper, closer. A brief streak of fire, then fragments falling through the mist. The field glowed faintly where oil had caught. Smoke drifted in long, thin ribbons across the ridge. Only then did the official order arrive. Open fire. It came with the clatter of headsets, the clunk of bolts, the chorus of men returning to rule. But by then, the first 2 targets were already gone. The system had caught up to instinct. Weiss stood beside the gun, hand still resting on the traverse wheel. Around him, the world moved without sound. Flames rose in slow motion, muffled by fog. The others shouted coordinates, range calls, confirmations, all distant, as if happening in another room. He didn't cheer, didn't explain. The figures in his logbook would record time and bearing, not deviation. What mattered had no line for it. The barrel steamed faintly. The smell of oil, iron, and wet soil mixed in the air. He knew what came next. The report, the reprimand, the quiet debrief that never reached a medal. But for now, only silence. The kind that comes after a system adjusts itself. Somewhere beyond the fog, others still flew, unaware that the pattern had changed. Rules define order. Instinct defines survival. By dusk, the fog had thinned to drizzle. Static crawled across the radio bands, merging with the patter of rain on tin. Messages came in pieces, broken coordinates, partial times, clipped voices flattened by distance. Somewhere down the valley, another unit had been hit. The same bomber wave, same direction. They hadn't seen them coming. Reports spoke of fuel trucks destroyed, tents flattened, bodies unrecovered. A short silence followed each broadcast. Then the next voice took over, continuing as if the pauses were part of protocol. Weiss listened without movement. The sound of the rain filled the space between transmissions. Then one fragment reached them clearly. Confirmation that the aircraft he'd engaged had been the vanguard of the attack. Their staggered fall had forced the rest to veer east, breaking formation timing. The bomb load that should have crossed his sector had missed the supply convoys entirely. It was proof, though no one called it that. In the record, it appeared as coincidence. The lieutenant filed the event as a premature engagement, useful, procedurally irregular. No commendation, no reprimand. Just a line of notation inside the system's endless paperwork. By nightfall, cold rain swept the airfield. Ash from the wrecks turned to thin black rivulets along the ground. The mud swallowed the traces of what had burned. The day folded into itself without announcement. Weiss stayed by the gun emplacement. He worked through the motions of post-action maintenance. Slow, deliberate, exact. Each part returned to its numbered place. He ran cloth over the barrel until the metal showed through the residue. The dent along the upper ring caught faint light from the distant generator post. Around him, the unit settled back into regulation. Men drifted toward tents, voices low, movements routine. Orders had resumed their rhythm, the system recalibrated, the anomaly absorbed. A breeze shifted. Somewhere beyond the ridge, engines murmured again. Faint, unconfirmed. Could have been Allied transport. Could have been another sweep from the north. Weiss didn't look up. He finished cleaning the breach, locked the housing, and checked the elevation wheel once more. 4 degrees back. He paused, then reset it to standard. He stood for a moment, watching the barrel steam in the rain. Fog returned in thin sheets, blurring the field's edge, until only the faint shapes of fuel drums and supply crates remained. The convoy route beyond the perimeter was quiet, untouched. Inside the records, his name would appear once, tied to a time and coordinate. The result would read, "Engagement successful, cause undetermined." No citation, no error. The system had folded his disobedience into its efficiency. He didn't dwell on it. The pattern had resumed. Orders would come again at dawn. He wiped the last of the oil from his hands and stood listening to the engines somewhere beyond hearing. Their tone shifted, like distance changing shape. The field was clean now, the ledger balanced. Only 2 craters beyond the ridge carried the memory of deviation. The system had survived, as it always did. He had simply corrected its rhythm for one breath of time. Would you have done the same? Morning brought no ceremony, only paperwork. The storm had passed, leaving puddles in the dirt outside the operations tent. Inside, the smell of damp wool, fuel, and carbon paper hung in the air. A typewriter clacked with unbroken rhythm. Pages were stacked, stamped, and passed across the table. Each line represented an engagement, a correction in the machinery of war. Weiss sat among others, boots still streaked with mud. The debriefing was procedural, a function of system maintenance, not memory. Officers read from typed lists, recording damages, expended ammunition, engine hours, personnel fatigue. Every sentence was a measurement. Every man, a statistic. When Weiss's name came, the tone did not change. Fired without visual confirmation, resulted in 2 hostile aircraft down. The lieutenant reading the entry paused briefly. A small hesitation, audible only to those listening closely. Then the list continued. No praise, no reprimand, only record. Regulations forbade commendation for unverified engagements. Procedure required the report to stand as written, incomplete but correct. Weiss's file remained unaltered. The phrase "reason unclear" appeared once in the margin. That was all. Outside, supply trucks were already loading. The convoy would move again by noon, the system continuing its pattern. Men cycled through their duties like gears in motion. Refuel, reload, recalibrate. War had no pause for interpretation. By nightfall, the field looked unchanged. The fog returned, thinner this time, drifting over the wreckage pits where 2 aircraft had fallen. Mechanics worked in silence beneath dim lanterns, repairing the mounts, recording barrel stress, recalculating recoil timing. Weiss watched them for a while, then turned back to his tent. 2 weeks later, his section was reassigned north. New postings, new coordinates, same procedures. The aim behind story followed him, spreading through barracks and canteens. It changed shape with each telling. A rumor of luck, an error that worked, a trick of weather. The details thinned out until only the headline remained. Men repeated it half in jest, unaware of how small the defiance had been. Weiss never repeated the maneuver. He logged every order by the manual, trusted the tables, trusted the chain. Yet something had shifted. A quiet awareness of limits. He knew that the system functioned not through perfection, but through tolerances, small deviations that it could absorb without breaking. He remained a reliable technician. His reports were punctual. His tone was even. No one asked about the fog, or the delay, or why he had moved the site. Years later, the records stayed intact. 2 kills, no authorization. Cause, uncertain. The language of bureaucracy preserved what the field could not. The exact coordinates, the firing time, the anomaly that could never be erased, only filed. The war's end brought medals to others, parades to divisions, plaques to commanders. Weiss's contribution lived inside a folder marked Miscellaneous. The typewritten lines faded with storage, but the pause in the lieutenant's voice, that moment of procedural hesitation, remained as the only trace of recognition. War moved forward as systems do, absorbing its errors, erasing its authors. The paperwork was perfect in its silence. Decades later, few names remained legible in the records from Foggia. The ledgers had warped under humidity. Their ink bled to gray. Machine numbers survived better than the men who operated them. Serial codes stayed sharp. Human entries faded. Corporal Weiss existed only as a faint imprint on a logistics roster. Column 4, Line 17, Anti-Aircraft Unit, Southern Sector. The ridge itself returned to scrubland. Grass covered the firing pits. Rust consumed the mounts. The field no longer held the sound of engines, only wind moving through hollow barrels. The war's material memory settled into storage depots and forgotten files. Crates marked ammunition expenditure now stood beside others labeled miscellaneous corrections. The paperwork outlived the soldiers. The system had preserved its own anatomy, timetables, throughput, consumption, the true machinery of victory. The logistics war left no monuments. Its evidence lived in movement, in quantity, in duration. What decided outcomes were not medals or speeches, but intervals. How many minutes a truck could make up on a damaged bridge. How long a mechanic could keep an engine idling without fuel pressure loss. The clockwork of supply defined the front line long before gunfire reached it. Weiss's action, one unapproved correction, fired seconds too soon, remained buried inside that larger rhythm. A deviation small enough to be absorbed, large enough to alter outcome. His defiance became a number in a column of efficiency gains, written without context. The philosophy survived quietly inside systems that came after. Every control network that depends on human precision carries the same fault line: the space between obedience and perception. Procedure demands delay. Instinct refuses it. Modern machines still rely on that uncertain geometry, where the human operator interprets rather than executes. The aim behind act, stripped of its circumstance, endures as an equation. Anticipation correcting inertia. It is the acknowledgement that delay exists in every mechanism: hydraulic, electrical, moral. Systems move slower than their signals. A man who acts inside that delay risks error and saves time in the same gesture. Industrial historians call it adjustment tolerance. In quieter terms, it is trust, the point where order must yield to judgment for continuity to survive. Weiss found that point once, beneath low clouds and broken radio. He never spoke of it again. By the century's turn, his name surfaced only in digitized archives. A researcher scrolling through scanned pages might pause at the line, uncertain what reason unclear meant. The war's scale had erased the texture, the fog, the static, the half-second choice. None of it recorded, all of it consequential. The ridge outside Foggia holds no plaque, no coordinates marked for remembrance. Yet its arithmetic remains. The system continues, inheriting his hesitation, refining it into algorithms that still depend on human correction. Somewhere, in a control room, another operator waits for a delayed command. The screens hum, the indicators flicker. Between protocol and instinct, there is a gap only one person can close. The noise of history continues. Faint, mechanical, unresolved. Would you trust the system or your own correction?